a number of topic sections that we'll be covering. The first of those is terminology around land use and planning. Two subgroups. We'll talk a little bit about some things related to housing elements and then about zoning. Next slide, please. So the housing element is part of a city or county's general plan, which sort of describes the overall vision a city has for how it's going to develop. The housing element is by far the most detailed and the one element that cities have to submit to the state for approval. It evaluates local housing conditions and identifies strategies to preserve, improve, and develop housing. They're due every 8 years, and one of the most important parts of the housing element is that it must show that the jurisdiction has zoned its land in a way that allows it to meet its regional housing needs allocation for all income levels. We'll come back and talk about that in a minute, but the city has to identify sites that are suitable and available for a range of development, single family and multifamily in particular. The housing element has a lot of other requirements, identifying barriers to development and a whole set of action programs. Specifically, recently added as a requirement that housing elements have to describe strategies to affirmatively further fair housing. And we will talk more about this later, but in short, that means it's not enough to just say we won't discriminate. Cities have to take affirmative actions to remove discriminatory barriers. Next slide. So an important part of the housing element process is what is called the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, RHNA, which is often referred to as RHNA. So RHNA is the process where every city finds out what its housing need or its share of the region's need for the next 8 years will be. So on a rotating cycle, the state determines how much new housing is needed in each region based on population and economic growth, assigns that number to the region, and then each region through its council of governments has to assign that need by formula to all the jurisdictions. There's a whole process by which that is done. And what comes out of that finally is the regional housing needs allocation, which is a list of every jurisdiction and the number of units that they have to plan for, broken out by income groups, which are above moderate income, low income, and very low income. And so cities and counties will then have to show that they have enough sites to accommodate those needs and for all economic levels, and for very low and low income housing in most places in the Bay Area, and certainly in both Alameda and Contra Costa County. In order for a site to be suitable for lower income housing, it has to allow at least 30 units to the acre to be a suitable site. There are a bunch of other requirements as well, but this is a really critical and important one. In the last round, it was very important because due to some changes in state law, the regional need increased from 188,000 in the last cycle to a little over 440,000 this time. So every city saw its need figure jump, pretty much double, which required a lot of work to identify enough sites. So once housing elements are prepared, they're submitted to the state, they're reviewed by the public, they're revised, and finally adopted. Once a housing element is adopted, that's just the beginning, and cities actually have to carry out those housing elements and actually do all of the programs and activities that they have called for. That might be rezoning some areas, it might be creating new programs, changing laws. And as part of that, every year, the jurisdiction has to do an annual progress report, which reports on both numerically how many units have been permitted and completed, but also provides a status update on each of the programs that was identified in the housing element. All of those progress reports are due to the state of California. by April 1st, and the state has a whole dashboard for looking at that. And then also the jurisdictions are required to have a public meeting where the annual progress report is considered. They don't have to do that before they submit it to the state, but they do need to do it. So if that has not happened in your jurisdiction, you should be asking the city when they are going to have their annual review of the progress report. Next slide. So the other area we want to talk about is zoning. So we've talked about there's the general plan, which defines sort of general areas of land use, like where is housing going to be. Zoning takes that down to the level of individual parcels. And the zoning code is a set of laws that defines different activities and what activities and uses are permitted on each parcel. You know, can you put housing there? Can you put retail, open space, industry, and so on? And that's broken down further, especially among housing. Different zones will allow different densities. So there may be some zones that are for single family, some that are for 2 to 4 units, some that allow much more density. So the zoning regulations talk about the density. They also have design and development standards, which means how high a building can be, how many units per acre. There, you know, things like setbacks, how far the property has to be away from the property line, parking requirements, and a host of other things. In order to get permission to build a project on a particular site, developers have to show that their plan follows or quote conforms to the property's zoning. And if it does, there's a couple steps and we'll talk about that. If it does not conform to the zoning, then a developer will have to actually apply to the city for what's known as a variance in order to get some sort of exception to what the zoning normally requires. Next slide. So one term you may have heard a lot is inclusionary zoning. Inclusionary zoning is a policy that encourages or usually requires that developers of market rate housing must include a specific percentage of units that are affordable to low income or moderate income households. So often you'll see ordinances that say every new development must include 10% of the units for low income or very low income people. And many cities have inclusionary zoning requirements. Most of those policies also allow developers to pay what are called in lieu fees. So instead of including units in their building, they can pay a fee to the city. That fee goes into the city's housing trust fund and gets used by developers of affordable housing to build affordable housing, including often types of housing that might not have happened through inclusionary zoning. So by right development, as I said, when you want to build something, you have to show that it is consistent with the zoning, and often you have to go through a whole review process, which may include an environmental assessment under the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, C-E-Q-A. Under some circumstances, there is what is called by right development. And this means that a developer can build a project that conforms to zoning without having to go through any kind of hearings or CEQA analysis, essentially by right. So as long as it meets the zoning and all of the development guidelines that are in there, the project can be approved. The planning staff will look at and go, yes, this is consistent with the zoning. That is called ministerial approval. California recently has passed a number of laws which allow projects to be streamlined and developed by right. Often, in order to get that streamlining, some amount of affordable housing has to be included in those projects, even if the jurisdiction doesn't have an inclusionary zoning ordinance. Discretionary approvals are sort of the other side. So projects that cannot be approved by right go through a discretionary process where the city reviews the projects to make sure that they are consistent, but often those require a set of public hearings before the Planning Commission, which will approve or disapprove a project. If it's disapproved, the developer can appeal that decision. Um, Other discretionary approvals also involve exceptions to the land use regulations. So if somebody's applying for a variance, a change from the zoning, that also requires a discretionary approvals. Something very important is any discretionary approval that a city takes is subject to CEQA review. So one of the reasons people really try to get by right approval, in particular for affordable housing, is it avoids having to go through the CEQA process and allows projects to move much faster and get built and occupied much faster. The next category we want to deal with is really about the development agreements and development process. We'll talk about three agreement types that you will see a lot and that we often refer to. The first is an exclusive negotiating agreement, or ENA. And an ENA is basically an agreement between a jurisdiction and a developer that they are going to negotiate over the terms for selling or leasing land for development. So the ENA may describe some specific parameters that'll be discussed. The really important part about an ENA is it is an exclusive negotiating agreement. The jurisdiction promises that for the duration of that agreement, they will not negotiate with anybody else. So you don't get into a bidding war or competing proposals. So if a city doesn't put property out there, they're going to sit down with one developer and go through a negotiating process. Those ENAs can be extended and often are extended if the negotiations are prolonged, but that's really the first step. Developers don't want to be negotiating with a city if they know that the city's actually negotiating with multiple people at the same time. What is actually being negotiated in those ENAs is what is known as a disposition and development agreement, which is an agreement by the agency to dispose of the land by either selling it or leasing it to a developer, and an agreement by the developer that they will develop a specific project with very specific guidelines. So it lays out all of the rules and regulations and commitments that will guide the project, all of the requirements, and a timeline for all of those requirements to be met. Disposition and development agreements can specify community benefits, including those that are included in a community benefits agreement. So a community benefits agreement is a formal document in which a developer agrees to provide specific benefits for the community, to local residents, to organizations, to government agencies, basically in return for support or approval of the project. Community benefit agreements are often based on the idea that new developments are benefiting from resources or actions taken by the government, which might be zoning approvals, it might be building infrastructure or transportation, it might be changing the zoning to actually allow the project to go forward. And the idea is that the local agency is giving the developer something, and in return, the developer needs to give the community something back. Community benefits agreements are also negotiated, particularly on larger projects that may have a significant impact on the surrounding community. For example, if there's a concern that a project might displace long-term residents, then there might be a community benefit agreement negotiated that has anti-displacement protections built into it and requirements maybe for priority for neighborhood residents to occupy any affordable housing. And so on. Community benefit agreements are often made between the developer and the city, but sometimes community benefit agreements may actually be made directly between the developer and community organizations. Those of you who are familiar with the Brooklyn Basin Project in Oakland, that's the form that the community benefit agreement took in that case. And I believe that wraps up those two sections. So we're going to pause for a minute and just see if anybody has any clarifying questions. Is there something I said that you don't understand or wasn't clear? We'll take a minute. And then, of course, we'll take questions at the end of today's presentation as well. I am not seeing any hands. So why don't we move on to the next section, Angelina?
Hello. Hello, everyone. I will be talking about affordable housing and affordability, and we can get started. So this term affordable housing often gets misused or used just like regular vernacular, but in public policy, housing is considered affordable when a household pays no more than 30% of its overall income on housing costs. So that applies to anybody who is living in an apartment, on a rental apartment, or they own their own home. It's just considered affordable if it's 30% or less. So it but oftentimes when we use the term, we are specifically referring to low income and moderate income households, and we'll go into exactly what low income and moderate income mean a little bit later on. But that's generally what we're talking about when we're talking about affordable housing. And because it's dependent on overall income, what is affordable to one household is not essentially affordable to another household. It's all sort of dependent on what the household makes, how many people are in the household, and what their total income is. And so, yeah. So it's sort of like on the flip side of that. So what does it mean if you're living in a place that is not considered affordable or 30%? Then your household is considered cost burden when you're paying more than the 30%. And especially like in places like here in the East Bay, many households are paying even more than the 30%, or like more than 50%. So that is what we consider severely cost burden. And again, homeowners and people who live in rental apartments can experience cost burdenship. And we wanted to highlight this National Low Income Housing Coalition report that recently came out that just emphasizes that especially extremely low income households are disproportionately experiencing what is considered severely cost burden, which is spending more than 50% of their income. And that is because, if your bucket of income is only a certain amount and it's less than whatever the fair market rate of housing is right now, then you will be paying more than 50% in comparison to other people who have above median income. Okay, so what is area median income, or AMI? You might hear this term like tossed around a lot to specify specifically like what the median income is. And it basically, the way that it's formulated is that that basically they get the whole income of the area and do a calculation. So basically 50% of households, to find the median, 50% of the households earn less and 50% earn more. And so whatever that middle part of it is, that is what is considered the median. And so who calculates this is HUD, and they calculate it for different regions. And for our region specifically, it's not just like Oakland. A lot of times we hear this, that it's like, well, Oakland's median income, or the median income that is happening from the city of Oakland, is not the same as another city. And that is because HUD uses the region. And for us, it's lumped up between Alameda and Contra Costa counties, and the median is taken from all of sort of like that area. And people who are AMI is used to determine sort of like who is eligible for government funding housing and other types of affordable housing. And this is a chart that explains what our region, Alameda and Contra Costa counties, RENA is for the people from different household numbers. So from 1 to 4, what very low income is so 0 to 50%, like I was saying, the sort of like the lower half of the median, and is considered low income, very low income, and sort of the 50 to 80% is considered low income. and anything above 80% is moderate, and above 120% of whatever that median number that was determined, it would be considered above moderate income. Okay, so now we're going to talk about subsidies and finance. We'll start off with what are considered deep subsidies. So deep subsidies. Public housing is affordable housing for low-income households that is owned and operated by a public agency. So it was called a public housing authority, rather than like sort of like a nonprofit or your for-profit developer is owned by a housing authority. It was funded through U.S. government, through capital subsidies of construction, and it was introduced back in 1937. However, since then, it's sort of been divested from the federal government. It's sort of all dependent on whatever the federal government determines, that determines like the budget and the laws around this. Specifically, Congress passed a law that barred public housing authorities from building more or maintaining more of the units that they have already been established. So we don't see public housing as robust as it used to be, because there has been sort of like this federal divestment that has led to deterioration, and a few properties have been sort of built since then because of the divestment from the federal government. Another sort of deep subsidy that is reliant sort of on the federal government is Section 8 or housing choice vouchers, as most commonly known as Section 8, or that's what people mostly know it as. And this is a deep subsidy that ensures that low-income households pay no more than 30% of their income in rent. So it's like stated that they will not pay more than that 30%. And so basically what the voucher is used for is they would pay the landlord the difference between the full rent and the amount that is affordable to the tenant. So whatever 30% of their income is, the voucher would cover the remaining part of that. It is funded by HUD, and it's run again by the public housing authorities in the local communities. And it could be either tied to the tenant themselves. So a tenant would be issued a Section 8 voucher, and they would find an apartment, an apartment with their voucher to be able to pay for that apartment. As we all know, it's affordable housing, or housing that's like at least 30% of your income is like almost unheard of in a lot of places in the Bay Area. So it is a little bit difficult to find apartments that either no one's allowed to not take Section 8 or housing choice vouchers, but there has been some discrimination around that. So it's a little bit difficult for tenants to find a suitable place to live with their vouchers. So there's another sort of like a different way that the voucher can be used, and that is a project-based voucher, which is tied to a specific unit in like an affordable housing development, for instance. And so somebody who has Section 8 can, or like an affordable housing building has units that are Section 8 are carved out sort of for like people with housing vouchers, and they can use their voucher there to be able to have that specific unit that they can live with, and they can pay sort of like the difference at that affordable housing site. Okay, now we'll talk about the capital subsidies, which are different than the other subsidies, the deep subsidies. All right, low income housing tax credits, or LIHTC. This is sort of like nonprofit developers. This is something that they use to be able to build affordable housing. They are issued by the federal government to a developer, which corresponds to the cost of building affordable units. The developer sells those credits to private investors who can then use them to lower their federal income taxes. And this helps the developer raise the capital to build their affordable housing unit, and reduces the amount of debt that they need to borrow from the bank. And so then that means that the developer can charge lower, more affordable rents to low-income households. So as we know, the market itself, like I was explaining earlier with the housing choice vouchers, there are not a lot of housing that is at that level of like fair market rate that people can afford. So this is sort of where nonprofit developers build housing specifically for people to make sure that they can afford it. So it was introduced in 1986 to sort of, because of the divestment from the federal government to government agencies who were building the housing, sort of nonprofit developers came in to sort of fill this gap. And by using LIHTC, they were able to create more buildings and house more people. Okay, so another example is general obligation bonds. And so these bonds are government issued bonds that are repaid from the state or local general funds or a dedicated tax. And so the city or county or state, whatever the jurisdiction is sort of backing this debt, and by paying sort of like and so they're basically backing it. And so they're issued with the idea that the jurisdiction will be able to repay the debt obligation through taxes and revenues from the projects that are created from the debt that was given to them. So an example of these are Measure U, which passed in 2022 in Oakland, which authorized the city of Oakland to issue $850 million in general obligation bonds. And that was used to fund affordable housing, transportation, and infrastructure, and also Alameda County Measure 8-1. And now in 2024, we're working on a 9-county, $10 to $20 billion general obligation bond. And so this is also like a very exciting thing that we're looking into the future, that we use these general obligation bonds to produce housing throughout the 9 counties. Impact fees. So impact fees are paid by developers to local governments to offset the cost of meeting the increased needs for public service. So basically, they are used to ensure that residential developments for higher income households create the resources needed to build homes that are affordable to lower income workers who provide the basic services and goods to communities. So when a market rate building goes up, like a high rise in downtown or something like that, an impact fee would be the developer would pay an impact fee to sort of, and hopefully what we always advocate for is for those fees to go to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, so that nonprofit developers could build housing to sort of meet the need of people who are low income. And another example of this is also for like commercial developments. Regulatory agreement. So a binding agreement between 2 parties that places income, rent, and other restrictions on or all of selected units of a property for a given period. A property financed with tax-exempt bonds or eligible for LIHTC is subject to a regulatory agreement, which means that the California Tax Credit, TCAC, and the owner of the property. In California, the State Housing Finance Agency imposes a 55-year affordability period for all projects awarded tax credit. So if they do have that LIHTC or specific tax-exempt bonds, anybody who builds a building has to sign on to this regulatory agreement to impose like a 55-year. So it has to be affordable for 55 years from when it was signed, so that it makes sure that like not someone just gets the LIHTC and then turns around and like, ups the rent or whatever. So like it would impose like affordability for those 55 years.
I think that's your last slide.
Okay, that's my last slide. Okay, any questions here?
I did see one.
Oh,
sorry. I was just gonna name this one question in the chat.
Oh,
but,
go ahead.
go ahead first.
Oh yeah, I just the impact fee one more time. I was gonna type it. So you said that's what a developer pays to the government in order to offset the cost. Oh, for the increased need. So if like transportation with busing or things like that, like I just a little bit more clarity around.
Yeah, so especially so if a development is for higher income households, so it's going to be like, some people like to call it a luxury, but like for higher income households, basically they would pay a fee that has, so basically each city and county has made their own policy around like how much the impact fee or how much the fee would be and what would it would go for, but they would pay a fee to make sure that that all the money could be used for like, yeah, anything like whatever the entity decided that that impact, the fee would
Got
go
it.
towards.
So that's more.
In the,
I'm
sorry?
sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was gonna say, so that's more for just not affordable housing, but just regular luxury living, you said more so.
Yeah, I mean, I think that generally, I mean, like I said, it depends on the jurisdiction, but generally it's sort of for like above or higher income households.
Gotcha. Thank you.
And I'll also just add that EPO was, I think, a principal, if not the only principal advocate for a long time for the creation of City of Oakland's affordable housing impact fee. And that was adopted in 2016. And unfortunately, our senior director of policy, Jeff, who was largely a part of that campaign, dropped off the call, but that's also something that we've been involved in and we continue to be involved in today in terms of impact fee advocacy. I did, oh, sorry.
Just saying, yeah, that's awesome. Awesome to know. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I think there was one other question I saw earlier. I think when we were talking about AMI, is the overall income considered pre-tax or after tax? And my understanding is this is, your household income is calculated by gross income, so that's total income received prior to taxes and other deductions.
Okay, so I think we can move on to Sophia, who will be covering tenant protections.
All right, thank you, Angelina, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to be covering tenant protections, which include the basics of eviction, what that is, and some protections against eviction, including just cause for eviction, right to counsel, which assists people who might be going through an eviction process, and then things like rent control and rent stabilization. Next slide. So in terms of some basic tenant protections that you may hear about and that EPHO advocates for, first let's talk about rent control and or rent stabilization. And they're similar but slightly different. Rent control is a policy that caps the amount, that is the actual number of dollars, that a landlord can raise the rent in a given year. Rent stabilization, on the other hand, is a policy that regulates rent increases by setting an annual limit on how much landlords can increase rents. And usually that's done by a percentage. So it's not the actual number of dollars, it's your rent can't increase by more than 3% or 5% or whatever in a year. Each policy serves to stabilize housing costs for low-income households who do not live in rent-regulated affordable housing that might be financed through low-income housing tax credits or etc. And they also discourage speculation in low-income neighborhoods where rising rents are leading to gentrification and displacement, which are some terms we'll talk about in a little bit. Related to rent control and rent stabilization, there are some important state laws that folks should know about. One is the Costa-Hawkins Act, and that's a California law passed in 1995 that limits the ability of local communities to adopt or strengthen rent control laws. This state law prohibits cities and counties from enacting laws that restrict the rent on vacant units, although subsequent rent increases on the new tenant who moves in can be regulated. It also restricts laws regulating rent increases on single-family homes or condos, and it restricts laws regulating rent on units built after 1995 or in some specified cases, earlier years. More recently, there was a law passed called AB 1482, otherwise known as the Tenant Protection Act. This law passed in 2019, and it provides an annual statewide rent cap of 5% plus the percentage of the consumer price index increase, as well as just cause eviction protections and relocation assistance that needs to be paid to tenants if they've been evicted for no fault or for just cause reasons. Next slide. Okay, so getting further down into eviction, just so everyone knows what we're talking about. Eviction is the process of removing or a residential or commercial tenant from where they live or do business. The reasons that a landlord can legally evict a tenant are limited in some parts of California by state and local protections known as just cause for eviction. Actually, those just cause protections apply statewide now with AB 1482, the Tenant Protection Act. Evictions also, you need to know that they often increase when gentrification is happening in a neighborhood, which often leads to the displacement of low-income residents and or communities of color. But evictions are also common among cost burden renters who often struggle to afford the high cost of market rate housing after they've been evicted and they're looking for a new place to live. So that means that the individual and communal costs of evictions are high. And in the Bay Area, where housing costs are very high, as we know, eviction can lead to homelessness. Rent stabilization and rent control policies, as well as things like right to counsel policies, Section 8 vouchers, and additional creation of affordable housing, and eviction moratoria are all important tools to reduce the likelihood and the harms that come from eviction. Next slide. All right, other housing related terms that you may hear frequently, or you may hear EBHO folks talk about and that are important. One is affirmatively furthering fair housing. And we talked about this a little bit earlier. And associated with that are things like redlining, exclusionary zoning. We'll get more into gentrification and displacement. And then a state law, the Surplus Land Act, and another suite of policies that are important, Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act and or the Community Opportunity to Purchase Act. Next slide. All right, so affirmatively furthering fair housing, you heard Jeff speak to this in the first section. And this is the idea that cities, counties, jurisdictions don't just have to promise not to discriminate anymore. They have to take affirmative steps to redress the harms that have come from previous discrimination in the housing system. And this is something that jurisdictions have been required to do in various forms, starting with the 1968 Fair Housing Act. But under the Obama administration, these obligations began to be strengthened as HUD began to require cities and counties that received money from the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development to create a data and community-driven plan to proactively end segregation and prioritize and promote inclusion. The new AFFH rule came under attack during the Trump administration, and Trump administration basically tried to make it disappear. But this rule is now being restored under the Biden administration. And during the Trump years in 2018, California recognized what the Trump administration was trying to do and passed its own law, AB 686, which created a separate but similar requirement that local communities in California incorporate affirmatively furthering fair housing into their land use plans and their housing programs, particularly including their housing elements, and pushing local jurisdictions on affirmatively furthering fair housing has been a major part of EBHO's recent advocacy around housing elements in the Bay Area. Next slide. So other additional terms, redlining and racial segregation. Redlining is and was a discriminatory practice whereby lenders would refuse to lend money or extend credit to home buyers in specific areas of town when when realtors would refuse to show properties to certain buyers in particular neighborhoods. So an African American family or individual might want to see houses for sale in a more wealthy neighborhood, and the realtor would not show them those properties for sale. They would what is also often called steering. They would steer them to show them properties in predominantly neighborhoods of color, for example. That's something that relates to redlining and racial segregation. So, and that's also related to exclusionary zoning, which occurs when zoning laws prevent people or prevented people from living in certain areas and discriminating by race, ethnicity, religion, income, disability, or another group characteristic. These laws have those laws have been invalidated in the 60s, but the harms from them continue and still affect the way our neighborhoods look. And even when the exclusionary zoning based on race was outlawed, often communities, especially wealthier communities and whiter communities, would often use things like single family zoning to keep neighborhoods segregated by using income as a way to segregate those neighborhoods. Because as communities of color often had less income and less access to assets, they often were less able to purchase homes. And so single family neighborhoods with single family homes were often not accessible to communities of color in the same way that they were accessible to wealthier and wider neighborhoods and residents. Next slide. Gentrification. Gentrification, I talked about earlier. This is when this occurs when historically disinvested neighborhoods, typically low-income communities and communities inhabited by majority people of color become the target for a variety of reasons of new public and or private investment. This investment will benefit the city or the jurisdiction in terms of maybe tax base and tax rate. It obviously benefits the developers and the corporations that are putting the buildings and the businesses up. And it'll be a benefit to higher income people that might move into the neighborhood, but not so much long-time residents. So this tends to harm existing residents by increasing the cost of living and increasing especially the cost of housing and changing the social, cultural, and physical fabric of the neighborhood. So gentrification often results in the displacement of low-income communities and communities of color. And sometimes this happens with developments that occur close to transit stations as a significant public infrastructure amenity that makes that new housing really attractive to commuters who might have lived in other neighborhoods but want to move in and be close to that transit related housing. And so in the advocacy that EBHO does around transit oriented development, we do a lot of work as well to try to prevent displacement and make sure there are policies to address that in TOD developments. And displacement is basically the process by which long-time and existing residents, organizations, or communities are forced to leave the places where they have historically lived or operated, often as the result of gentrification. There are other causes of residential displacement, including racial discrimination, foreclosure, demolition, other kinds of development, and obviously also a lack of affordable housing. Next slide. Just a couple of policies that we also want to mention and that EBHO often references. And these are the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act and the Community Opportunity to Purchase Act. TOPA is a policy that gives tenants the first opportunity to purchase their building when their landlord puts it up for sale. And COPA is similar to TOPA, but it is something that gives qualified organizations, including affordable housing developers and community land trusts, the first right to purchase the property. TOPA and COPA policies can help to provide permanent affordability to those buildings by preventing those previously unregulated housing units, turning them into resources that will be permanently affordable to residents rather than being lost or sold on the speculative market. So this is a way to combat gentrification and displacement, and can also provide affordable homeownership opportunities for low-income households. And that brings us to the final slide, I believe, or the final term slide, which is related to the Surplus Land Act, which is a California law that states that when cities, counties, and other governmental agencies decide that they want to sell or lease land that they have determined they no longer need, they need to prioritize it for affordable housing development. Under the SLA, local government entities must declare public land surplus or no longer needed for its original purpose. And in order to sell or lease it to another entity, that agency must first offer the land to priority groups, including affordable housing developers, who agreed to make at least 25% of the units affordable to low-income households. If no affordable housing proposals are received or agreed to, and the land is later developed for market rate housing, then still at least 15% of the units must be made affordable to low-income families and individuals. All right, that was a lot. Is there anything that I said that didn't make sense or for which people would like clarification?
I think there were 2 questions in the chat already, Sophia.
Okay.
One, I think related to unincorporated areas, and I think that was when you were discussing AB 1482 and tenant protection coverage. But feel free to correct me if that was not the question. But I think it was when you were talking about AB 1482.
Okay, let's see, can we find the question or can we restate it? Is the question, does AB 1482 apply to unincorporated areas, or what is the exact question?
That's my understanding. Letitia, if you'd like to come off mute, you can clarify your question. But yeah, I read it as I think whether it applies to unincorporated areas. Yeah, that's what she meant.
Yeah, broadly, yes, it does apply in most circumstances, but I know, for example, in South Alameda County, where there's been a lot of advocacy around tenant protections in unincorporated areas, one of the questions that folks have, and the reason they've been advocating, is they've said it's all well and good, but it still provides it can still be a really large rent increase if we're talking about 5% plus whatever the increase in the consumer price index is, which in recent years has been pretty high, has even been close to 5%. So folks have been advocating for a more stringent percentage amount, I know.
Yeah, and I'll just add quickly that while AB 1482 does apply to unincorporated areas, it largely depends on the housing stock. For example, in Alameda County, a lot of the housing stock is single-family homes. So unfortunately, a lot of those renters don't enjoy those protections. And I'm going to share in the chat is a updated kind of know your rights fact sheet from our partners at Public Advocates. We don't have time to get into it today, but there was an updated bill that passed last year that EPO supported and went into effect earlier this month, April 2024. So it just kind of updates some of the protections that you would enjoy from AB 1482. And I'd highly encourage, to share that 2-pager as a jumping off point, because I think a lot of these specific tenant laws very complex and nuanced and layered, and at EPO, that's not our direct service, but we have a great resource guide on our website with some legal aid and, tenant partner resources, which is what I'd answer to the second question in the chat of, how do you find out how much a tenant is due relocation fees? Our first piece of advice would be to contact a legal aid or a tenants' rights groups to really, explain those particulars of your situation and find out your rights, because they are complicated and depends where you live and depends on what kind of building you live in. And so there's a lot there, but that's the first step that we would advise. And we can put into the chat that link to our website that has those resources. I know we're coming up on time, so I'm sorry if if folks had other questions, you can feel free to reach out to us and I'll provide that at the end of today as we're closing out today. I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us today. On behalf of the policy team and our staff here at EPO, we really appreciate your engagement. For more resources, because we tried to fit as much as we could in this hour, please have a look at our study room. It's our online resource guide with nooks, kind of like a virtual library where you could dive into different chapters of how did we get to housing, how did housing inequality become this bad, you know, or how do we build power? What solutions do we know work? Those are all different nooks in our study room. EBHO also has a glossary of housing and land use terms, which covers all the terms that we discussed here and more. We actually probably didn't cover, I think, half, because there's a lot of terms in the glossary. So I know my colleague Angelina is putting the links in the chat to those. Please feel free to bookmark them and use them. That's what they're there for. And then lastly, we just want to invite folks to our Affordable Housing Month kickoff, which is next Wednesday, May 1st in Oakland. We really invite you to join us to celebrate some incredible housing heroes, honor our 40th anniversary, and connect with others who are passionate about a just and equitable East Bay. And so additionally, you know, the kickoff obviously kicks off a month full of great events in May. On the right side of the screen, you'll see our great calendar. That's just a week screenshot. There's a lot of calendar events, over 30 events throughout May. So we really look forward to seeing you in person or online. And we just want to thank you again for joining us today. And please keep your eyes peeled in your email for our follow-up email for this event and the recording and other resources. But thank you again for spending the hour, and hope to see you at some Affordable Housing Month events.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Okay. Good job, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. I feel like I can breathe now.
Same here. I think we did good on time, actually. So that was good.
We managed to get through all of it.
I think it went well. Thank you, everyone. I hope it felt smooth to you guys.
Yeah. Okay, Megan, I'll see you on the other Zoom.
Sure.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank